It's no secret that stress and mental illness are huge problems in America. In one survey, it was found that nearly half of all Americans report that stress has a negative impact on both their personal and professional lives. And in the 2019 Mental Health in America report, 44 million Americans suffer from mental illness. Now, it's been well documented that stress and poor mental health can have severe physical impacts on your body, not just psychological. If you want more information on how stress and mental health can impact your body physically, check out the books Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers and Loneliness, Human Nature, and the Need for Social Connection. Both will be linked in the description below. What we're going to focus on in this video is the impact that stress and mental health can have on your productivity. It's been found over and over again that high levels of stress and lower levels of psychological well-being have been associated with lower workplace productivity. One study found that, I quote, lower happiness is systematically associated with lower productivity, end quote. And another study that tried to predict what variables would best predict a worker's productivity found that, I quote, the strongest predictor of productivity was psychological well-being, end quote. And in terms of stress specifically, two studies, one on real estate salespeople and one on nurses, both found that the more stress that the worker had, the less productive they were. Now, some people might argue that all of these studies are largely just correlational. We don't know whether it's the stress that actually caused the loss in job performance or if it's the loss in job performance that caused the stress. And this is definitely a very valid point. However, two studies make it seem as if it's more likely that the lower psychological well-being is actually causing the loss in job performance. As one study found, I quote, a systematic program to identify depression and promote effective treatment significantly improves not only clinical outcomes but also workplace outcomes, end quote. So essentially, if we treat the poor mental health, we can see the job performance go up, which suggests to us that it is the poor mental health that is actually causing the decline in the job performance in the first place. Another study found similar results. I quote, our results corroborate those in the literature that indicate mental disorders are significantly associated with decreased work productivity. In addition, these findings indicate that treatment for these disorders is significantly associated with productivity. So again, we can see that treating mental health disorders actually leads to increased productivity, which tells us that most likely these mental health disorders and this high level of stress is actually what's causing a decline in productivity. So the question is, how can we improve our psychological well-being, and how can we lower our levels of stress to not only see an increase in productivity, but to also see an increase in psychological well-being, and to avoid all of the physical problems that come with high levels of stress and low levels of psychological well-being? The answer is, of course, if you read the title of this video, meditation. Now, usually when you bring up meditation and you tell people that they should meditate more, they typically have a negative response. They feel like meditation just isn't for them, that meditation just doesn't really work, and that it's just a fad and is over glorified by the media, and that it doesn't actually do that much. Just sitting there and paying attention to your breath, how is that going to have any impact on your behavior whatsoever? So, of course, the literature probably suggests that meditation is largely a placebo effect, right? Actually, not at all. In fact, the exact opposite. The literature so overwhelmingly states that meditation is hugely beneficial to your psychological well-being and to your stress levels that it's overwhelming to go through all of the literature that supports the beneficial effects of meditation. And again, meditation isn't just something that we can see people subjectively reporting to us. It's not that people are just telling us that they feel better or that they feel less stressed. We can actually see measurable changes in their brain that tell us that, yes, what they're saying actually makes sense. If they say that they have lowered levels of stress and that they're able to regulate their emotion better, we actually see that the prefrontal cortex inhibits the amygdala better in their brains, and we're able to see decreases in amygdala response. So again, these aren't just things that are subjective measures. We're actually able to use fMRI data and EEG data in order to see actual changes in people's brains. I want to emphasize that point because that's what we're going to be going over in the first half of this video. The way that we're going to break this video up is in the first half, we're going to look at the main benefits that meditation has been shown to have in the clinical literature, with an emphasis on the actual changes in the brain that take place when people meditate. First, we're going to be looking at the changes in electrical activity. Then we're going to be looking at changes in how your brain perceives emotional distress. And then we're going to be examining changes in gray matter volumes. And then we'll look at just some general effects of meditation that have been reported in various studies. Then in the second part of the video, we're going to be getting into how you can start meditating yourself and tips that I can give in order for you to build your own practice. I've been meditating for over 3 years consistently, and just recently I've been meditating for 30 minutes a day over 100 days. So I know how to develop a good meditation habit, and again, a lot of those tips will be backed by research. So let's go ahead and dive into the first section where we look at the various effects of meditation, and let's start with the first part where we look at the changes in electrical activity that we see in the brain because of meditation. So the first study we're going to be looking at is one performed by Jon Kabat-Zinn, who is one of the leading researchers in meditation research. What Kabat and colleagues did in this study was they split people up into two groups, one control group that did absolutely nothing, and then one group that received a meditation course for 8 weeks. They took brain scans of both groups in order to see the changes that would happen in the brains of those who meditated versus those who didn't. And at the end of the 8-week study, they found incredibly interesting results. They not only found that left frontal activity was significantly increased in those who had meditated for the 8 weeks, but they also found that when administered with the influenza vaccine, those who meditated had a much stronger and better immune response to the influenza vaccine. So why is this study important? Well, left frontal activation has been associated with this thing called positive affect. Positive affect is defined as, I quote, the extent to which an individual subjectively experiences positive moods such as joy, interest, and alertness. Negative affect is essentially the opposite, and people with increased left frontal activation tend to have much higher positive affect than those who don't have that increased left frontal activation. And this has been shown in numerous studies. In one study, it was found, I quote, groups demonstrating stable and extreme relative left anterior activation reported increased generalized positive affect and decreased generalized negative affect compared with groups demonstrating stable and extreme relative right anterior activation, end quote. And again, another study looking at patients who were depressed found very similar findings. They found that people who were depressed tended to have much lower left frontal activation, and what was really interesting is that even after people who had depression had recovered and showed lower and lower symptoms and essentially were normal, they still did not have this left frontal activation. It appeared to be a trait of people who were depressed that they just naturally did not have high levels of activity in the left frontal cortex. So the question is, why is positive affect important? Well, not only do you have better mood, but positive affect has been linked with increases in cognition. One paper summarized a lot of the literature on this really well, and it's really clear that positive affect does lead to increased cognition. And this study proposed that it might be because of the increased dopamine levels that are associated with positive affect. So now that we understand that left frontal brain activation is associated with positive affect, which is associated with greater cognitive performance, the question is, does meditation actually increase this left frontal activation in other studies too, not just this one? And the answer is absolutely it does. In one study, it was found that only 5 to 16 minutes a day within just 5 weeks produced changes in the electrical activity of the left frontal part of the brain. Now, while we don't know if these changes stayed consistent after this study happened, and also while we didn't see any changes in actual effect, meaning that people in the study didn't develop any increases in positive or negative effect, we did indeed see this increase in left frontal activation. And another study did find that 30 minutes a day for 5 days was enough to produce not only increased electrical activity in the left frontal part of the brain, but also improved activity in critical brain areas in self-regulation. Now, there was one study that looked at the long-term effects of mindfulness-based meditation, and it found that there were no changes in lateral asymmetry, but there were changes in frontal interhemispheric coherence. However, most of the literature does seem to point to the fact that meditation does indeed increase electrical activation in the left frontal part of the brain, which is great for us because this means that we'll have a better mood and we'll be able to have increased cognition due to this greater mood. Now, the second part of this video is going to focus on the changes in the brain that relate to the increased emotional regulation that people experience when they meditate more and more. So the first study that we're going to be looking at is one done by Sarah Lazar and colleagues that found a relation between perceived stress and between the gray matter volume in the amygdala. What they did was they got a ton of people who were really stressed, they put them through a mindfulness-based program, and at the end of the 8 weeks, while they didn't see a significant lowering in the perceived stress score in this study, they did have incredibly interesting results. At the beginning, they measured everyone's perceived stress score, and they scanned their brains to measure the gray matter volume of their amygdala, and at the end, they did the same thing again. And what they found was that the gray matter volume in your amygdala decreased proportionally with the decrease in your perceived stress score. Essentially, the more your stress score decreased, the more your gray matter volume in your amygdala also decreased, which tells us that the amygdala definitely plays some kind of role in stress response. And this is important because mindfulness and meditation has been found to affect the amygdala in other studies. In this one meta-analysis, it was found that meditation seems to be associated with more efficient prefrontal cortex inhibition of amygdala responses, improving emotion regulation. Now, what the heck does that mean? What that means is that your prefrontal cortex, right, is basically your center for your logic and your reasoning. It's what you use when you're solving something like maybe a math problem or you're trying to explain why something works to someone. There's obviously other areas of the brain associated with that, but this is kind of our human brain. This is what makes us human. We have the ability to think coherently and reason, stuff like that. And your amygdala is what is responsible for your fight or flight response. So let's say that you see a car coming 40 miles per hour right at you and you're standing in the middle of the road. Your amygdala is going to activate and you're going to jump and get out of the way. And you're going to have an extreme fear response course through your body. Now, what this study means when it says that the prefrontal cortex inhibition is increased, it means that when something happens, let's say that you get a test back and you get a really bad grade and it was not the grade that you were expecting. Your amygdala is going to have some kind of a fear response, a strong emotional response that's going to induce some kind of stress. However, with meditation, your prefrontal cortex, which is the more rational part of your brain, can actually stop your amygdala from having as intense of a reaction. And the way this will look like in real life is in therapy. This is frequently something that's employed doing things like cognitive behavioral therapy. What happens is that when you have this amygdala response, initially your prefrontal cortex then uses logic and reason in order to shut that response down and make it so that your emotional response is not so overwhelming and makes it easier to deal with, which is great because this means that we can manage our stress better and we don't have to let our emotions take control of us. And a great quote from this study that I want to cite here is, I quote, "This suggests a neuronal explanation that provides support for the stress-reducing effects of the training found in traditional meditation research." Now we're going to start diving in to the third section where we're going to be looking at the actual changes that happen in the brain in terms of the gray matter volume and other various benefits of meditation. So Sarah Lazar and colleagues had two really groundbreaking studies when it came to meditation. In the first study, it was largely correlational. What they did was they took two groups of people that were largely matched in demographics who are meditators and non-meditators, and they found one incredibly surprising finding. See, as we get older, the cortical thickness in our prefrontal cortex tends to decrease. Again, this is the frontal area of your brain that's responsible for your logic, your reasoning, and your thinking. And this is why, as we get older, it's kind of harder for us to reason, to learn, and to do new things. We're kind of like a computer losing processing power as we get older, because our cortical thickness declines. However, in people who meditated, this decrease in cortical thickness was not seen. I'll pop up a graph on the screen right now. As you can see in this graph, people who meditated were able to maintain the same level of cortical thickness even as they got older, and those who did not meditate saw the expected decline in cortical thickness, which is an incredibly impressive and surprising result. We can see that meditation actually prevents some of the effects of aging by making it so that you retain some of that cortical thickness. And again, this was largely a correlational study, and that's very fair to argue. You know, people who meditate might just be demographically different. They might be more likely to be vegan, to be vegetarian, and these changes might actually be responsible for the differences in gray matter between meditators and non-meditators' brains. So Lazar and colleagues decided to do another study where they actually did a causal experiment, where they had people meditate for 8 weeks and did brain scans in order to see the changes within people's brains. And they had incredibly impressive results. One of the most impressive results had to do with the hippocampus. I quote, "The hippocampus also contributes to the regulation of emotion, and the structural changes in this area following mindfulness practice may reflect improved function in regulating emotional responding. In contrast to these increases, several pathological conditions, e.g. major depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, are associated with decreased density or volume of the hippocampus." So again, this change in the gray matter of the hippocampus might actually suggest why it's easier for people to regulate their emotions. And again, the hippocampus was not the only area of the brain that was changed. I'm going to pop up a couple of the graphs from this study, and you can see several areas of the brain had huge, significant changes within just 8 weeks. A great quote that sums up this whole study really well in terms of all the other areas of the brain, because we don't have time to go into every single area of the brain and describe what changes in that area of the brain mean. To sum it all up, it basically means, I quote, "The results suggest that participation in mindfulness-based stress reduction is associated with changes in gray matter concentration in brain regions involved in learning and memory processes, emotional regulations, self-referential processing, and perspective taking." So again, we can learn a little bit better, we can remember a little bit more, we can regulate our emotions better, and there's so many other benefits. And this was a huge finding because, again, we can actually see changes in our brain. It's not just people perceiving changes, it's actual changes that are there. Now, the next few studies that I'm going to cite are just kind of studies that are like cherries on the top. They don't have huge sample sizes, and we can't really conclude anything specific from them. However, they do have incredibly important things that we can see, and again, they're corroborated by all these other studies that I've mentioned before that have seen the changes in brain chemistry. The changes in brain chemistry that we've seen so far would account for a lot of the results in the following studies. The first study will look at, I quote, "A group randomly assigned to 5 days of meditation practice with the integrative body-mind training method shows significantly better attention and control of stress than a similarly chosen group given relaxation training." So again, we can see attention and control of stress here. In another study, 88% of the participants improved their stress scores while 90% demonstrated increases in self-compassion, end quote. And then I quote, "Compared to controls, intervention participants recorded greater satisfaction with life, decreased job burnout, and decreased distress," end quote. And again, we can see better control of stress once more, which is great for us because we want to know how we can reduce our stress levels. And now, in another study found that there is a significant relationship between creativity and meditation as well. Because meditation improves cognitive effect, they're able to see greater levels of creativity as well after they meditate. And again, this is because when you are in a better mood, you're able to be more creative. So these are great findings as well. I'm going to pop up the 2 graphs on screen that are most relevant from this paper. And again, one more study found that emotional intelligence was greater in people who meditated versus those who did not. They found not only correlational data to back this, but also did a causal experiment. And again, in that causal experiment, while there was a small sample size, they did replicate those findings. And the very last video that we're going to be looking at is one that investigated the effect of mindfulness meditation on the emotional states of depression, anxiety, and stress. And what was interesting about this is that the severity levels of all effective measures have decreased by the end of the meditation course. Participants with severe emotional difficulties at the time of commencing the meditation course demonstrated the most notable improvement over time. These results suggest that mindfulness training is beneficial in reducing the symptoms of subclinical depression and anxiety and can substantially reduce stress. So again, this is great for us to hear because we want to know how we can improve our psychological well-being and how we can reduce stress. And so now that we've gone over a lot of the research that covers the benefits of meditation, let's go ahead and dive into the second section of the video, which is how you can get started on meditating today. So if you want to learn how to meditate, you don't actually have to get any kind of paid course or paid program or anything like that. There's a completely 100% free app that you can use that I recommend called Headspace. I use Headspace all the time, and its free version is absolutely fantastic. Now, the paid version is $80 a year, but I 100% recommend it. I know that students can get it for $10 a year or something. There's a significant discount for students, which again is absolutely fantastic. For me personally, I believe that meditation is worth any amount of money because of the significant impacts that it can have on your physical and psychological health. Now, once you choose what app you want to get started on, if you want to choose Headspace, I believe there's an app called Calm as well. I know that Apple themselves, if you have an iPhone, also has some meditations. There's lots of apps that you can look up, and I'll link some in the description below. But again, I recommend Headspace. That's what I have the most experience with, and that's what's helped me cultivate a love for meditation and incorporate into my daily life the easiest. Now, the tips that I have for meditation is that you don't need to start big, start small. If anyone has read the book Atomic Habits by James Clear, they'll know that the best way to build habits is not by going all out and doing 30 minutes a day or 1 hour a day of meditation. It's by doing as little meditation as you possibly can every single day. Just do a couple of minutes of meditation, and again, Headspace has this feature with 3-minute daily meditations. You can just do 3 minutes a day and then slowly build up over time once you get in the habit of doing that. That was how I started. I started doing just 5 minutes a day, then I started doing 10 minutes a day, and then I slowly upped it to 20 minutes, and now I'm at 30 minutes a day for over 100 days. And again, The benefits that I've seen have been absolutely huge. They've really helped me identify problems in my thinking, they've helped me calm down in emotionally distressing situations, etc., etc. If you've made it this far, but you still think that meditation might not be for you, and if you think that you've tried meditation but it just doesn't do anything for you, I will say this. It takes a really long time sometimes for meditation to really click and to make sense. As Andy Puddicombe, the founder of Headspace, talked about in one of his interviews, there's this guy who meditated for 360 days straight, but just didn't feel any difference. And then on day 362, that was when it hit him. It made a huge substantial change in his life right at that point. So again, as long as you are consistent with it and you show up every day, even if it feels like nothing is changing, trust me, things are changing. Your neurochemistry is changing, the gray matter volume in your brain is changing, etc., etc. There's lots of benefits that you can expect if you stay consistent with meditation. So one more thing that I wanted to discuss real quick. If you are meditating, a great way to improve your meditation practice and to also make it easier to meditate is by reading some books. Now, there are several books that I've read that have really changed my life in terms of how I understand meditation, but the best one was probably Power of Now. Well, The Power of Now is a bit of a weird book in terms of how it talks about like the universe colliding and stuff like this, and it's very spiritual and not really scientifically backed. The things that he talks about do make meditation make more sense. Another book is The Joy of Not Thinking by Tim Grimes, I believe. That's a really good book as well that I really recommend for anyone who's thinking about getting into meditation. Another book is Full Catastrophe Living by Jon Kabat-Zinn. This one is a little difficult to read because it is a more complex book, but it is still really enjoyable and beneficial to your meditation practice. I'll go ahead and throw up a couple more books on screen that I believe are really useful and that have helped me out that I forgot to mention maybe here. And yeah, that's about it. So I hope that you do decide to try meditation, and I hope that you are able to see significant psychological benefits from it and physical benefits as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.